Welcome to episode 3 of the CSEC podcast, season 1. This episode is Care and the End of Life. I'm your host, Jennifer Scuro, faculty in philosophy at Malloy University. My guests are Adrian Flores, the ALCS Emerging Voices Fellow at the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Harold Braswell, who's the Bicentennial Fellow and Associate Professor at the Gnaegi Center for Healthcare Ethics at St. Louis University. He's the author of The Crisis of U.S. Hospice Care with Johns Hopkins University Press. And Anne-Marie Parachuk, Professor in the Barbara H. Hagen School of Nursing at Malloy University with specialization in nursing, maternal, child health and neonatal nursing, pediatric nursing, and palliative nursing. She's the lead author of The Voice of Mothers Who Continue to Express Milk After Their Infant's Death for donation to a milk bank. A content warning for this episode: there will be detailed discussion of suicidality, suicidal ideation, end-of-life care, trauma, stillbirth, pregnancy loss, a discussion of aid in dying and ableism, as well as palliative care, trauma, survivorship, violence of anti-Black racism, and self-harm. We hope that you get something out of these discussions. This is a long-form discussion, so please pace yourself and enjoy.
Okay. So I wrote my one and only but very dear book, The Crisis of U.S. Hospice Care. It came out at the end of 2019. And in that book, I think I was mainly concerned with the lack of a sufficient public discussion in the United States around end-of-life care, around dying, not death and dying, mainly dying. And that was an important thing, to understand that, yes, death and dying are related, but dying is its own category. Dying people have experiences, I guess with theologians I might argue, but I don't really think dead people do in the same sense. And I think dying people often get sort of ignored. And the category of experience, dying experience, often gets kind of flattened and marginalized. And my sense at the time was that there were a few reasons why this was the case. I'm happy to talk more about that. Part of it was that the conversation we do have about dying is very much tethered to what's called either alternatively aid in dying or assisted suicide, which in the book I argue is a topic that I'm neutral on as much as it's argued in the United States. But that I think that it's a very limiting framework for how we think about dying. And in some ways, the proof of that limitations is our actual end-of-life care system. That this whole conversation has been going on, that very passionate conversation, people, I would say yelling at each other, but it's not bad to yell at each other, by the way. I mean, these are very passionate feelings. And yet, yelling about a procedure or an act where there really was, at the time, it seemed to me, the lack of a broader system that might nurture something like a good experience of dying. Now, by good, that's like a complicated concept when you apply it to dying, because I don't know if anybody would think of dying as good, certainly not uncomplicated good. But, I wanted to say that, look, at least we gotta start thinking about what this would look like, and it's a lot more complicated than either banning or legalizing the right to die.
I go back to my dissertation work, and I worked on Emmanuel Levinas, and I remember reading God, Death, and Time, where he responds to the concept of death as, it isn't about one's own death, it's about the death of the other, of the proximal other. And but he has this phrase that stuck with me: every death is a scandal in being. And I always loved how
that's amazing.
It was the only book I ever read all through my research that made me weep. and as a purely conceptual way, I mean, about the kind of like reframing of how we think about, you know, the end of one's life and the kind of rituals that we attach to it, and then reframing it with this like intellectual or critical perspective. And I think this is what I really want to start our conversation with, is that what I think we assume in the US is that the rituals and the infrastructure and the, you know, kind of investments, you know, the economic public welfare investments are operative until there's experience. And you say in the book, I think we need to like take personal experience and private experiences and weave them into a public, working public narrative.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Adrian Flores. I'm the ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow at UC Santa Barbara at the Walter Kapp Center for the study of ethics, religion, and public life. But I'm also on a grant at UCLA. So the UCLA has an initiative. It's called the Initiative for the Study of Hate. And I'm collaborating with a professor of psychiatry looking at Black child suicide and trying to understand how, at least within the field of psychiatry, Black suicide is screened or not screened, right? And so trying to track the anti-Black racial logics in those manuals, right? And so that's what we're working on right now at UCLA. And at Santa Barbara, I'm just working on my book. So my book, or I guess my manuscript, is What is Suicide? Entanglements of Philosophy and Literature and the Afterlife of Slavery.
So this is for the episode on care and the end of life. My work has been where I, you know, did a book on miscarriage, and so that kind of way in which a lot of those questions about what the end of life looks like, what I'm getting to do with a podcast episode like this is broadening the meaning of end of life, that we don't have to associate it directly with this hospice care and palliative care, but like all the ways in which we might have an underdeveloped discourse about the relationship we have or the cultural understanding of death or passing, especially when they're untimely or they're unexpected, or they don't fit the framework of what most people perceive as end of life, right? And I think that might be a way for us to kind of position a place for your work. Also, what got you into this work?
That's a good question, because I get that question a lot, and I usually have two narratives, right? And then usually in an academic setting or in a more professional setting, I tell them that what inspired me to pursue questions about suicide or just about death in general and relation to race and racism was an experience that I had when I worked in student affairs before graduate school. I was responsible for training 30 interns every quarter at UC Santa Cruz. And at that time, this was 2006 or so. At that time, there wasn't a lot of awareness around the unique experience, the unique structural experiences of undocumented students at the university, right? Now there's a lot of awareness, more so than at that time, right? And there were no real resources available to these students. And so we had several undocumented students. And I was basically put in a position where I was made responsible and supporting these students and trying to come up with resources for them, not just emotional, psychological resources, but financial resources, material resources, such as getting books, for instance. Because of course, as undocumented students, they had no access to financial aid, right? So anyway, I had a couple of students who were suicidal, and one in particular attempted suicide. And that really, as you could imagine, disturbed me, right? Seeing her in the hospital her mouth completely covered in charcoal, having to deal with her, but also with the administrators who actually visited her as well, really bothered me, right? The way she was being pathologized, the way she was being treated by not just administrators, but just the whole situation was just so dehumanizing in many ways, right? And then having to deal with her parents, right, who didn't understand English, right? Having to deal with her parents, having to deal with the psychologist, dealing with administrators, being part of those conversations just really bothered me, that there wasn't any room for talking about structures, systems of violence, and so on, right? Completely individualizing her experience with suicidality, right? But what specifically bothered me, or what scared me, was that when I was talking, because I had a really good rapport with the student, and this is why it was so unsettling, because I was surprised by her decision in many ways, right? But once talking to her and listening to her why she attempted suicide, I agreed with everything she was saying, right? And that's what bothered me. It scared me. I scared myself, right? It's like, wow, the reasons that she was giving for wanting to kill herself made a lot of sense. It was a very rational decision, right? There was nothing irrational about her wanting to kill herself, right? And a lot of it had to do with her being a real burden on her parents. Her parents were really struggling, right, financially, right? And of course, the emotional baggage that produces, right? I mean, her parents were not doing well, right? And then she explained, like, she had no future, right? Even if she, was able to graduate with a BA, she wouldn't be able to get a job, right? So anyway, so that scared me. Like, I agreed with everything, but it was also, and this is going to my second narrative, right, where it's a bit more personal, more intimate. I saw myself in her as well, right? Because at that time, and for many years afterwards, right, I struggled with suicidality myself, right? I mean, it got to a point where I was actually planning my own death, right, my own suicide. And I mean, I was, the most recent rumination that I had a couple of years ago, actually, was, I wanted to go to the Redwoods, find some clearing there, and take a combination of anti-nauseants and fruit preservatives, right? I mean, I was really planning things, and I was starting to save money, right, for my funeral and that kind of stuff, to not burden my parents that much with funeral costs. And so listening to her, I saw myself and her experience. I mean, I know it's completely narcissistic, and that's part of the violence of empathy in some ways, right? Because my parents also were undocumented for many years, right? They struggled. They sacrificed a lot for me to be in college. I'm the first person to go to college in my family. And my parents, talked about the psychological traumas of being humiliated by their bosses, right? The racism. I mean, they didn't have that. I mean, now they do, but that time when I was growing up, and they would tell me these things, they didn't have the language of race and racism, right? But in retrospect, that's exactly what they were talking about. The racist violence that they would experience as immigrants, right? Who didn't know English at that time, right? Who were also illiterate in Spanish, right? And so that experience with that intern really did reveal a lot about myself, right? that I agreed with her precisely because I shared the same desire, right, to die, right? And so anyway, so in grad school, my original project was going to be on colonial tropes and gay pornography, right? But the question of suicide or of self-destructive behavior kept coming up, right, for me, right? And so I dropped my original project and started thinking about suicide, right? And it really started with, weirdly, I took a geography course because I guess my minor for the PhD is human geography, and in this class we had to read Kafka's The Trial, and so after reading that and having discussions in the seminar, questions about agency and death and even suicide in some ways, right, were coming up, and my mind was just percolating with all these thoughts and all these memories, right? Very personal memories of my own desire of wanting to die.
It's so helpful because I think too, when, and I'm thinking again about Harold Braswell's work and the overlaps, similar to that, it's this combination of finding oneself brought to the work, through this kind of interesting path of personal experience that, I say as an academic, everything is research. The worst of it, me writing about my own, experience with pregnancy loss was never, when I went through it, something I was thinking was bankable knowledge of any kind. Right. But I do think that this is where what I'm finding fascinating in these conversations that I'm having with people is that sense of vocational quality to the research, that a lot of this research isn't the armchair work of maybe a scientific study, and to some degree those social sciences that study phenomena, social and political phenomena, aren't going to be able to tap in the same way to this kind of deeper problem of how that human element really works in society, especially when it comes to questions of harm, the ways in which systemic violence really operates. And I think I've said this with my students often with learning ethics, is the stuff that we're really interested in isn't the obvious, if it bleeds, it leads kind of model of violence. It's the stuff that looks so naturalized and so normalized. Right. And when you mentioned about the pathologizing of the student you talked about, that also is something that we see a lot in the disability studies literature and the trauma studies literature, is the problem of pathologization. Because when we see people in positions in need of care, the mechanisms start kicking in which people go into a mode of kind of institutionalized care that ends up being more harmful. It isn't actually tender or nurturing, it's bureaucratic. It's, again, that pathologizing element as a form of violence is not something that a lot of people in healthcare professions or therapeutic professions are really open to having a conversation about, because for them, that's their armor. Right. Which you did not have. Like you said, when you're watching the interactions, you yourself were actually realizing the degree to which your survivorship was very much kindred to her survivorship, and the reasonableness of her position, the validity of her experience was something that you were able to tap into, which I love that fuels your research today, because I think that as academics, I think the misperception, especially as ethicists, that we have some kind of in to like how things should go, but usually the ones that I love and people I'm talking to really are genuinely invested in a sense of humanizing those things that had led to a form of like systemic or pervasive dehumanization, and ones that get passed on from generation to generation to generation. Those are the most complicated ones, because it's like where is it coming from? Sometimes it's that internalized stuff that gets carried over. And
Right.
so the other thing, and I want to talk about this a little bit more, because here again is a beautiful overlap with some of the other work that's being done in this very difficult set of areas, is that perception of burdensomeness and the perception of no future. Robert McGruer, and this is a note for my student, Robert McGruer talks about in his work on crip theory about no future for crips, right? So like the no future problem for disabled people is a longstanding one, but that burdensomeness, that both that feeling, but also that we don't necessarily get validated in our society unless you can prove that you are disburdening, that you are not a free rider problem in our society. So that leads me to one more comment on this, and then you can kind of think about how you might want to respond both through your work and also based on what your narratives are right now in terms of new work that you're doing. But I do think one of the things I've learned in academia, especially dealing with first generation, I myself being first generation to a degree, my parents got like associate's degrees later in life. So I was really the first to kind of go in and experience that was the economic is existential. And so the fact that you brought up Kafka makes me very happy, because it really is hard to explain how those economic burdens, sometimes really unevenly placed on a student or younger generations, or people who are working the hardest, seem to be the least supported when it comes to their perception of economic burdensomeness, right? So they're doing all this work and yet they're multiple jobs and the exhaustion factor, right? The disabling qualities of that. But I do think that even in higher ed still, there is a misperception that the economic isn't existential. It's just it's a bureaucratic fix. Sometimes it is throwing money at it, or it is throwing alternative self-help resources, which I find extremely taxing, especially in the trauma stuff, is self-help therapeutics, the whitewashing of self-care language. A lot of that does not really alleviate the material realities that do lead to these kinds of existential crises for especially young people or disabled people, and to some degree even elderly people, right? So when you're put in the most precarious of positions in our society and you're not productive, I think the question of your material standing can really lead to this kind of moment of crisis, to the point in which, like, what control can you get? What agency is available to you? And then you can imagine very reasonably, like you said, that, having some agency over some of it might lead to these kinds of plans where it's like, I'm better off. The only thing I have power over is this.
Right.
Yeah.
I see that in my research. That comes up a lot, right? Fundamentally, right? Suicide is about the future, right? And that is precisely what drives, or what structures, I should say, structures the fantasy of suicide. And then, of course, I'm speaking in very general terms, but the fantasy of suicide is that you'll be able to survive your own death and to actually achieve relief, right? I heard it with, that intern. I see it and the narratives that I've been reading, right, for the research that I'm doing now, talking to people who have who were suicidal, who have attempted suicide. There is this investment in the future, right? And it's really not a commitment to death itself, but a commitment to a different life, right? And I think that's a huge misunderstanding, at least in the field of suicide research, that is precisely the paradox of suicide. It's not about death, it's about wanting to live, right? It is a response or a reaction or a symptom of what you were alluding to, of our material conditions and so on, right? Or really of the imperatives of capital, of having to constantly produce meaning in life and so on, right? To purchase, consume, and et cetera, right? So that I see that a lot, and I also, that's true for me, right? When I was suicidal, it was wanting to enjoy relief, right? To actually live a life without pain, right? And the only thing that was preventing me from doing that was my flesh, right? That was the only thing that I had access to, right? The at least that's how it felt, right? Especially when I was younger, when I was still living with my parents and seeing them struggle, right? And the immense guilt that I experienced, right? And I'm not trying to personalize it, but it's very common in a lot of the narratives that I've read or just listening to people is like this student, right? And I'm talking about people of color, right? The guilt that comes with seeing parents struggle and sustaining your life. And that was especially true for me, just feeling incredibly guilty of not being able to contribute or to help my parents in any way. I felt like I was a burden, right? Their future was vested in me, right? Which is a huge, huge burden for someone like myself, for an individual, as a 12-year-old, for instance, right? Because that's really when my suicidal thoughts were beginning to take form.
And so the thing I want to transition into a little bit
Mhm.
is you do mention that there's really little room for innovation in end of life care. You
Mhm.
mentioned this in the book, and I think that's a really important provocation for thinking about end of life care in new ways with the actual stakeholders, with the people who work in long-term care versus the people who are family members of people who are going into those care systems. As much as those competing interests are there, that there's really important work that has to be done in creating innovative connections.
Mhm. Yeah, this is great. I mean, so this is, and I know this is what you mean, but I want to clarify. So I think there's enormous room for innovation in end of life care, and in some ways, I think that's where actually I'm very biased, but I think we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck actually in sort of innovating this. But in terms of actually existing end of life care, to use an old phrase from the Cold War, like actually existing. So communism would be bad, but so it's sort of like actually existing end of life care. It is very constrained. We need to really broaden, sort of the way that we're thinking about it. I mean, I think that right now we were talking before, we got on a little bit about this. What does the end of life mean? The end of life means you have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live, given to you by a doctor. That's generally how we define the end of life in the United States. And I think if that's what we mean by the end of life, then yeah, we're going to be very, very limited in terms of what we even can do with that. The prognoses can be inaccurate. There are, to this very system, to get on hospice care, you have to give up more potentially curative interventions, which many people are, I think, to some degree, understandably reluctant to do. So they get on hospice until too late. There's also Ava Hoffman wrote in the New Yorker about for-profit hospice. Basically, hospice is also $1 billion industry at the same time, and there are all sorts of incentives built into that sometimes can work out to provide people with better care, but a lot of the times don't. So we got to work with that stuff, but there are limitations, versus what I would think about is, there's a hospice saying that was going to be the title of one of the chapters, but it got changed, called "The End of Life Doesn't Begin at the End of Life." So, everything that's gone on in a person's lifespan and in the lifespan of their family, their caregivers, every family issue, stuff that happened 40 years ago in a family is going to end up in the room at the end of life. In that sense, it's a condensed period, but it's also highly charged. with affect and highly confusing in terms of thought. And this makes it sort of a catalyst for a lot of things. So that's part of it, how I'd want to expand it. And, the other thing is too, is that, I think that we do have something of a consciousness of dying from essentially the moment we're born. I don't write about this in the book because I hadn't read it yet, but this is another thing that I've been thinking about, and maybe I will write about. There's a British psychoanalyst named Wilfred Bion, Bion, whom I like a lot. And, Bion makes an argument, and he says, how can we as adults understand what a baby is saying when it's crying for food, without anthropomorphizing the baby, without sort of like just putting on our own words in it. But at the same time, there's an emotional intensity in the baby's cry that, as I know you're a parent, I'm a parent, you don't need to be a parent to think this, by the way, but like you want to respond to. And, his translation of this is to say, not that the baby is saying, I'm dying, but that the best way we can understand the intensity of what the baby's feeling as adults is to think, okay, what they're saying is, I'm dying. They're feeling like they're dying when they're hungry for food, that it's a total shutdown and that it's a complete emergency. And, I think that's quite a provocation, because it's sort of like the end of life begins at the beginning of life. It begins with when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're most exposed, when we're most on the brink. And that's something that's part of life. That's just the thing we negotiate throughout our lives. And then, you have moments throughout your life and you have fantasies of it as well. One of the things that it occurs to me as we're talking, more worried about with COVID is because on the one hand, we haven't really changed the long-term care system. Yet on the other hand, I do think in a weird way, there's a broader consciousness of how bad it is. So what does this lead to? This leads to people having fantasies of what it's going to be like and how they can't get into a nursing home no matter what. And thank God they're not in a nursing home, right? And rather than, however, how do you move from that to changing the nursing homes rather than just further trying to separate ourselves from the people who are in them, which is kind of what I've seen happening, and certainly in Canada, where the nursing homes, I don't know if they're still occupied by the military as all of this is going on, but until very recently were occupied by the military. I see happening. So yeah, I'm much more for, what do we talk about when we talk about dying? Let's bring everything we can into that. All of the affect, all of the cognition, all of the ethics, which are difficult ethics. And I really mean that. That's partially why I didn't want to give any sort of definitive recommendations like this is like what is ethical, is not ethical there. Now I might, later in my life, I don't know. But for the meantime, it seemed to me to hopefully open up a conversation where other people can bring things in that I don't know about and that I've learned about as well.
I think this is why I've always been so interested and invested in the work that you do, because I think as an ethicist, you don't go right to, suggestions or outcomes. And I think your hesitation is really informative, instructive, because what you do resource is narratives. You keep coming back to collecting kind of what for me is interesting, like the liminal cases, these or in some ways the generic cases, what's happening over and over again that isn't, kind of available from a generalized view. And I think your ability to capture the narratives in ways that really, with a neutral voice, also allow us to become stakeholders in those narratives, that we don't find ourselves as just bystanders with a lot of it. And you do talk at the end of the book about your own experiences and talk a little bit about that feeling of becoming a bystander in relation to the caretaking work of a loved one. And I think a lot of people that I've talked to who deal with family members going into palliative care parents and whatnot, it is that strange positionality where you don't have any narrative. Not only you don't have ritual, but you aren't the one that is dying, and in some ways providing conditions in which you are the responder. You are the first responder in many cases, despite, I think you talk about it as being like the unprepared person, right? I'm like the last person as the child of someone who is dying to be the one that is the first responder to all the care, because there is so little narrative, there is so little resource for me to draw from. And again, the charge, the affective demands that are being made are, for many people that I know who don't do this as a field or don't have a lot of resources, it can be an extremely traumatic experience. It can be also make the person who's the caretaker very unwell.
Yeah.
It has that effect.
Yeah, so right now we're looking at specifically at manuals that suicide prevention practitioners use or rely on for screening suicidality. And no surprise, right? There isn't much critical work on these manuals, right? Let alone for Black children or racialized children, right? There's really nothing, right? And that's what's so troubling. It's a bit scary, actually, that there isn't scholarship on this, right? That critically looks at how practitioners are being trained for identifying suicidality, right? Let alone to think about how structures of race and racism, as you were mentioning, right? Conspire to create these desires for self-annihilation, right? And so, yeah, so that's where we're at. We're just really coding these manuals, right? But my colleague, she deals with patients and the parents of patients who have died by suicide. And yeah, I mean, I know suicide in general is remains an enigma. I mean, that's true. I mean, many scholars of suicide do admit this, right? That fundamentally we really don't know what causes suicide, right? And so that's the struggle that my colleague is facing, right? Having to deal with parents, right? Whose kids are not only suicidal or, also who actually died by suicide. And to see how, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at, the sometimes it feels hopeless, right? As herself as a practitioner, researcher, and then myself who's in the humanities, trying to bridge the humanities and the medical sciences, it does feel hopeless because the discourse of suicide is so overdetermined by really a white metaphysics when it comes down to it, right? The European Western metaphysics.
And I think it's interesting too, because as you mentioned, I think of the Kantian injunction, suicide is one of the first examples for him of like the categorical imperative, you just can't, you just ought not, right? And the rationale, even when I would teach it to students about that, the dignity of persons rests, that you also have to uphold it for yourself, that you are part of that. And the that Enlightenment narrative is not only obviously connected to that white metaphysics, right? That European model of individual, of will, of self, of volitionality, but I think it's a fail even when you keep applying that same model over and over again. I think of, similarly, when we talk about like utilitarianism, when it comes to in disability studies, we see, Mill's utilitarianism, that
no suffering is permissible, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. But then you take it to an ethicist like Peter Singer, who then keeps applying the principle language and the kind of mechanisms of that theory over and over again, to the point in which it begins to kind of counter a lot of what would be just a base humanization of a whole class of people, particularly disabled people. Right. So his assumption is that like there is a reasonable, plausible, morally acceptable way of imagining infanticide, right? So like the non-viability of a significantly disabled, infant, that's a life of suffering, therefore should not exist. It's like that calculus is a form of violence in itself that perpetuates what always has been the case, is you're using very old tools, right? For the master's house, right? The master's house keeps reproducing itself over and over.
The discourse of suicide writ large is overdetermined by a white metaphysics, by Western metaphysics, right? That is the history of the idea, the language of suicide and suicidality. It's from the 1600s, right? In the throes of the Enlightenment, right? And around the same time when ideas of personhood, of individuality, of self, etc., right? It's even in the word itself, suicide, suicidium, right? Self-murder. It's so overdetermined by that afterlife, right? And I think we and this is what comes up a lot in the research, right? The way, there was a recent study that came out of how even coroners write about the deaths of Black teens and Black children, right? They really don't use that much language to talk about those deaths. So in many ways, these deaths go undetermined, right? But when it comes to, and at least in this study, when it comes to white suicides, right, there's a lot of language, very extensive narratives of how these deaths are described, and words like depression, anxiety, stuff like that, right, get imputed to these deaths, not to these Black children who are killing themselves, right? Those words are really preserved for non-Black people, right? And so that's what's so difficult to do this research, right? At least both in the humanities and in the sciences, from what I'm learning, right, is that the data, you have to come up with your own data, because the data that's available, such as coroner reports and so on, or statistics, are just so, again, wrought by the afterlife of slavery, really, when it comes down to it. Or as I was saying earlier, Western white metaphysics, maybe I don't know if that's answering your question, but like I guess what I'm saying is that, or my complaint is that there isn't much out there really that's critical of the discourse of suicide, right? There aren't that many people who are doing this critical work, who are not really thinking about suicide, ironically, right? Because of the fixation on the causes of suicide, right? And not really interrogating the category itself. Like, what is that category producing, right? What is it negating, right? In order for it to be coherent, morally coherent, right? And so that's what I mean by it being overdetermined, right? And why it's so difficult to do this research, right? Because of the blind spots that, again, are already determined in advance, right? By this long history of colonization and slavery, right? And which, of course, Western metaphysics subsists, right? Yeah.
I at the in the book you talk a little bit about that, the paradoxicality of perceiving the end of life in relation to the concept of a closed future. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to kind of, lean into that question. I was thinking a lot of Joe Stramondo's work
Mm.
on the master narrative of the open future
Mhm.
that sometimes really does lead to many parents mourning and grieving their disabled children.
Mhm.
Because the perception is that suddenly what should have been an open future is now a closed future, and how much harm can come from that. And I think there's a rich conversation to continue in that way too, is, you know, by including a more expanded concept of mourning, you call it collective mourning, there's this way of kind of navigating the kind of paradoxes that, or at least the perceived paradoxes of end of life as being its own sets of beginnings or changes that could be quite open-ended and full of possibility, which,
Yeah.
you know, I think for an ethicist, what the work has yet to be done, right? We have a lot of work to do there that would be so meaningful and could be so and so so much a salve to some of the real grief that comes from the bystander position, which is that we're all kind of like on a train we can't get off of, and the train's gonna, you know, get to the station, and that idea of like, you know, it all comes to an end.
Ideally, we would have enough of a kind of pre-existing sense of enough narratives, enough of a pre-existing sense of how this could be, and enough of a support team, network, society there, so that this person could experience some of what's new. Because I do think that, you know, the end of life, there's always going to be an element of newness about it. I certainly wouldn't want to change that. But how can we make it into a newness that is difficult, that is challenging, but that can ultimately facilitate connection, growth, growth through loss, through an ability to mourn and incorporate sorrow, versus a newness that needs to be dissociated and projected out. You know, that's too much. That's too much that a person can handle. And I think that that's for sure what's going on probably most of the time in America. And, you know, that's what I'd like to see happen a lot less. And you know, for that to happen, because this is a very complicated problem, you're going to need a lot of people to be involved. And so my hope in the book, and it still is my hope. So things have changed, but I not totally, is to create a space for hopefully more people, more thoughts, more feelings, more options in terms of what we can do, can enter what has unfortunately been, to my mind, a very closed and limiting conversation that leaves us very ill prepared for the moment of our own dying and the dying of the people who we love.
It becomes such a third rail kind of conversation for so many people, for good reason.
Yeah.
But I think what you're offering here, as much as the research itself can be fairly feel hopeless,
Yeah.
in some ways, what you're also finding is a lot of potency in altering and creating a little bit of a paradigm shift in how we need to dispose of kind of that approach as a causal question. Like, what causes it? And again, social sciences have done what they can,
Right.
I'm sure, but just by digging around, and you see the real stakeholders,
Right.
who are the really people at the most risk and who bear the most impact without
Right.
any benefit. And
Right.
what you find in the research that you've been doing is that there's a category error, right? There's category errors in several different places, that's why it's very exciting for me, because when you have this kind of research, that you have interdisciplinary aspects too, like you said, that kind of like humanities plus science, social sciences, and giving that kind of back and forth dialogue.
The person that figures greatly in my work and my manuscript is the work of Toni Morrison. And I think, I know, I shouldn't say I think, I know that people forget or somehow blind themselves to the fact that most of her books deal with suicide as a category, right? And really questions whether Black suicide is possible, right? Even her master's thesis, right, was on this question as well, right? Is Black suicide possible? Which is to say, is suicide always white, right? And so it's really, I think, getting at I guess you could say, the constellation of these ontological predicates, right, that give coherence, right, give meaning to what we mean by suicide, right? It's always not Black, right? And so of course that requires a lot of philosophical and theological work for trying to track how she, right, is mapping out or undoing the category itself, right? And so that's how it figures in my work. I ground it in literature, right? The same thing with Moby Dick, right? I hate that book, right? It's such a tedious book, but it's a foundational text in the study of suicide, right? I argue that it's the text of modern suicidology, right? And it's precisely because the founder of suicidology in its contemporary conception, Edwin Schneiman, he was obsessed with Moby Dick, right? And specifically with the figure of Ishmael, right? And he uses Moby Dick and Ishmael's journey in the novel as a way to understand suicidality and what prevents Ishmael to not kill himself, right? And so Ishmael, for Edwin Schneiman, right, is the prototypical suicidal subject, right? This white guy, right? And so in my work, right, I track that genealogy, right, but I focus on Pip, right, who attempts to kill himself several times, right, but can't die, right? And so in some ways, Pip's impossibility of dying by suicide is what provides coherence to Ahab and Ishmael and so on, right? And of course, Ishmael, right, is biblical, right, signifying alienation and so on, right? Which is to say that the paradigmatic subject of suicidality is one that is alienated, right? Pip, his grammar of suffering is not alienation, right? His grammar of suffering is slavery, right? Captivity, right? And so that's what part of my work is looking at those competing grammars of suffering, right? And how the grammar of suffering, right, in the hegemonic discourse of suicide, causation, and prevention, is one of alienation, of an alienated subject, right? There's no room, right, for questions about captivity, for histories of slavery, and so on, right? So I do that, right? But I also look at the Decalogue, the Bible, the Ten Commandments, right? And make the argument that the Decalogue is the unconscious of the discourse of suicide prevention, right? And so I go through that, right? Go through how, and it's really raising questions. And you kind of suggested this earlier, the sanctity of life, right? And how that continues to structure how we think about suicide, both within the medical context, in the humanities, right, and popular culture, etc. Suicide is always bad, right? Despite our claims to secularity and so on, right? But it's fundamentally Christian, right? That is the history of suicide. It is Christian, right? And Western by definition, right? And of course, it's white. So we're talking about a white Christianity. So anyway, so that's how I tackle these questions. I ground them in the Bible and literature, or I guess that's redundant, but yeah, in literature.
Redundant is not the word I was thinking of. You can
What
hear
were you
I'm like this. This is, it's just fascinating. And when you said it to Toni Morrison, that was who was in my like in the background too. So one overlap, which is why this is fascinating to me, is because I just put forth a proposal on birth privilege is white privilege, which is kind of an interesting, other end of it, which is like, the ability to, have children and give birth and be preserved and maintained, as also a white privilege. I feel like there's not a lot of literature that does that yet. But in a similar kind of way, is it even possible to think outside of the framework of that white privilege that seems to dominate a lot of the discourses about infertility, let's say, so I very much appreciate how you are thinking through this and what kind of tools you're using to get to that very subtle shift that would need to happen if we are to really kind of reframe and make available an alternative access point to this question about the possibility of what is Black suicide possible, is a really important meditative point, I think, of something like your project.
And just to be clear, that question, is Black suicide possible? Obviously, it's not an empirical question. It's like, of course, Black people commit suicide, right? So it's a theoretical question, right? That needs to be reckoned with, right? And that some Black psychiatrists have reckoned with it. And it's like, no, it's not possible. It's always a lynching, which is to say that these fantasies, or at least, I guess, more broadly, right, the desire to die, or just desire in general, is never our own. It's always structured by language, right? It's structured by discourse, determined by discourse, right? And so if you take Saidiya Hartman's, work on the afterlife of slavery seriously, right, then yes, the desire to die is structured by this afterlife, right? Which forces me to reconsider, right, the intern that I was talking about earlier, right, like her wanting to die by suicide, right? It's like, yeah, that is a protracted form of genocide, you could argue, right? Like history was telling her to die. She does not, and I mean, it's more complicated than that, but I think there needs to be a way to talk about these afterlives of violence, right? Such as colonial violence or slavery, right? And how they continue to structure our desires, right?
I think that was part of what my note here is, and this is up to you if you wanted to talk about this at all, but I kept thinking about that ongoing question of self-harm too, because I think some of the discourse that's dominant will stretch over to like, well, there's forms of self-harm that are kind of like slow suicide, like, or signaling a suicidality. And I think that's where the discourse on self-harm, much like the discourse on self-care, is really an extension of the same underlying, unreckoned narrative.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, like who's actually delineating the limits of suicide, right? Or at least, the how it's identified, right, or how it's recognized, right? There are competing discourses, there are competing institutions, there are competing, I guess you were saying earlier, you were thinking about in terms of stakes, right? That there are stakes, right, high stakes, and maintaining certain boundaries for identifying suicide in certain ways. Like, for instance, drug abuse, right? Overdoses. Is that a suicide? Was that suicidal, right? So when someone overdoses, right? Coroners obviously declare, especially when it's a person of color who overdose, don't declare them as suicides, right? Why can't we? You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I mean, how do we define suicide? That isn't necessarily questioned, right? It's not a controversial thing, unfortunately. This is what I mean, like the ironically, people who study, the causes of suicide or ways of preventing suicide, right, are not thinking about suicide themselves, right? And it's precisely this is one of the issues that isn't really thought about, right? Like, what are the limits, right? A lot of people are self-harming. I self-harm. I'm a heavy cigarette smoker, right? I know it can kill me. I know that, but here I am, smoking, right? Or someone who goes off to war or whatever,
And that's why I
ancient and unsanctioned suicides, right? Yeah.
Disability studies is such a powerful resource for me, because I always think of the ways in which very often survivors are self-medicating and comfort seeking and stimming, for lack of a better description, or kind of trying to find ways in which they could create mediations and comforts against the kind of very claustrophobic qualities of captivity that come with a society that is hostile to your kind of embodiment, to your body mind.
Well, I don't know if you know this. We got to talk more often, but so I'll give you two things, two tracks, and then I'll tell you how I'm maybe thinking about them going together. I'll leave the scholarship thing to the side for a second, but I don't know if I got a social work degree, actually, and I'm working as a psychotherapist. So I'm actually calling you from my clinic right now, which is the Schiele clinic. It's the low-fee clinic of the St. Louis Psychoanalytic Institute. And this had been something I'd wanted to do for a long time. It came to a head during COVID. And I would say that there are two things that really provoked it. One, my biological father died, and he died in a way that was particularly grinding and horrific for me, I would say, in a completely overwhelming sense. You think you write a book about this stuff and you're an expert about it and you're ready for stuff, and then life throws you for loops, man. Like it really threw me for quite a radical loop. And trying really hard not to drop gratuitous swear words here, but but basically it did. But in a weird way, I do think it got me to move forward on this thing that I had kind of wanted to do for a long time, and to do it. The other thing was COVID. I was homeschooling. I couldn't really do the kind of research I do. I do ethnography. That's not all I do, but that's a big part of it. And I was homeschooling my daughter, so I could take night classes via Zoom during the good old days of COVID. So I got working on it, and now I've graduated and I'm working towards licensure. And it's been amazing. Frankly, as scholars, we're alone most of the time. And I don't think I quite understood that. I don't think I had any understanding of it. And I'm not saying it's bad, by the way, necessarily. I like being a scholar. I'm still a scholar. But sitting with other people in a relatively small room for 50 minutes, it triggers you in all sorts of complicated ways. And it does make you wonder, what have I been kind of excluding, just from this experience of being in close physical proximity to people, that there is something that's different about that. And also all of the things that we're talking about here, and that, this understanding of this expansion of the psychic space of dying, the understanding that people deal with fantasies of dying all the time, every day, that people are going through and they're thinking about, well, if I was dying, or, you're crossing a street and, a car is coming a little bit too quickly and you see they stop at the stop sign, but then you just think, man, if they had just kept going here, that's dying. Okay. And it's part of the way that you consider who you are on a daily basis. And that has implications for actions and for what you could think, feel, and do in all sorts of things that seem, quote, unrelated to dying, but it's always there. And so that's been a big thing that I want to keep doing and keep working on and keep figuring out how to integrate into my scholarship, which is not the most linear process to figure out, but I'm working on it. In terms of my scholarship, I've been working on and off on a book on housing discrimination. and end-of-life care. More off than on, but I'm making good progress on it, actually, in my own plodding way. And that's a topic that I do talk about in my first book a little bit. But, you know, it's like a section of the book. And now it's going to, but I think it deserves its own book. And it's interesting because in some ways, it's the same book. It's not like a critique or a disavowal of my earlier work, but in some ways, it's such a radically different book than that. Because, you know, my first book is written from the perspective of the hope that sort of America can become something else, okay, can become a country that is, you know, I don't know when you went to elementary school, but I went to elementary school in the 80s in New York, and you learned about the Great American Melting Pot. And, you know, it did actually trigger a little bit of idealism in second grade Harold back in the 80s. I was like, this is cool, man. Like, it'd really be cool if we are this pluralistic, wonderful country. That's really cool. And I think that we're not, and we haven't been. That was incorrect at the time. But part of my first book is sort of written from the hope, like, okay, how do we get there? And what happens when you add dying to the pot as an ingredient in that? And I think that to talk about that, you got to talk about anti-Black racism. You probably got to talk about some other stuff too. But I think anti-Black racism is a really big thing that we need to talk about. You know, we need to talk about it in material terms, because we have a country where our geography, our sense of who we are as individuals, our material resources are not totally, but very significantly determined by whether we're Black or not, and what resources we've been allowed. We and our parents and our grandparents have been given as a result of that. And houses have a particular value in the United States, a material value, and of course also a symbolic value. Private home ownership being sort of the consolidation of the American dream throughout much of the 20th century as well. And we also have an end-of-life care system that is built around the home. That is, where end-of-life care is designed to be delivered at home, where our fantasies of what good dying would be dying in our homes. That's sort of been the larger master narrative. And now there are all sorts of other conceptions of this that are out there too, but that's been the narrative that's kind of created the system, yet with no reflectiveness about anti-Black housing discrimination and how that would intersect with this and interconnect with it. You know, I would also say in my more kind of, I wouldn't want to say speculative and denigrated, but in my more kind of psychotherapeutic mindset, you know, I think that fears and fantasies of dying can often be racialized, can often have a kind of racial component to them that we've got to think about and we've got to talk about, and just to kind of open up a space to reflect on what it might mean. That it's not just like, here's dying, let's add race and combine them together, but that our sense of both of these things have kind of evolved in tandem, and that it's a lot more dynamic than we've been talking about. Now, what that means, I'm figuring it out, and it's taking me a while because, you know, probably I'm resistant to doing it, and also because it is actually complicated and I'm trying to go slowly. But that's something that I've been working on and will be working on for at least a little bit more.
I really appreciate that. I think when I talked to Adrian, my other guest for this episode, that was one of the directions he discovered in his own work. And his was more literary based, but that the relationship between suicide and Black identity and anti-Black racism was a real problem. It was in the training prevention manuals, to the ways in which coroners wrote their reports. You see a pervasive kind of problem of not recognizing Black suicide as suicide. And
Wow.
so I think this is a really intriguing overlap, that when you do scholarship in this area and you really do the kind of frontline work of really seeing the impacts. And I think what we discover is these more systemic problems that actually are the real work is in what does it look like to really address it from a perspective of housing. You in the book you talk a little bit too about, you know, the concepts of nuclear family and a lot of those value systems that create mythologies. So here too, this idea of the home being kind of one of those central stories we tell ourselves, for better or for worse, but it also leads to a lot of constraint on what's possible, and again the real disparities, the real injustices that might be underlying a lot of those generalized, accepted, normalized practices.
My name is Dr. Anne-Marie Parazuk. I am currently professor in nursing in the Barbara H. Hagen School of Nursing at Malloy University. That is my full-time position. I am still working per diem as a mostly inpatient, some outpatient lactation consultant as well. I have been working with families who have experienced a perinatal loss since the mid-70s. So quite a long time. And I have seen some, change, some positive change happen over that time. One of the things that, obviously this is a very, very devastating experience for these families, but, I guess because of long-standing social acceptance of, or recognition, let's put it that way. Recognition is probably a better word. Social, it's really the society didn't want to discuss this. And this really has some basis in it, because when you look back into the, early part of the 20th century, the infant mortality rate was very, very high. And so, it was, okay, this baby didn't survive, you move on, you have another one next year. And that's kind of how it was. And yet, even into the mid-70s, some of that was still persisting, because the people who lived in that time were, now grandparents, I guess. So, I just found that the support was just not there for them. So that was really what prompted my interest in the end-of-life care, for also because of what was going on in terms of the neonatal. So I started off working in, with mothers who have had a loss, as I was a nursing student, working as a nurse's aide in labor and delivery. But then my first job was in neonatal intensive care, and that has also changed tremendously since the mid-70s. And we're able to do so much more for these babies than we ever did before. And so, the question started to come up in the 80s is like, okay, yeah, now we can do so much more, but should we always? And it was always this, heroics and, what as a nurse sometimes I saw as futile, care. And so that's kind of where my interest was, where it really kind of started. And then I kind of combined that with the work that I do as a lactation consultant, because also seeing the issues that can arise. And mostly I saw them from, from the point of view of the neonatal unit, because that was mostly where I was working with, families. But, that these, babies who would die very early, like nobody wanted to tell them that, when you go home in 3 days, your breasts are going to fill with milk. And it was, again, that's nobody the people don't want to talk about. I don't say nobody, but there was just this hesitancy to talk about it. So then we started putting, the pamphlets in the packets that we sent them, and thought, okay, well, we have this packet, and they send it home and they have the information in there. But I found out from the research that I did that some of the issues from what I had seen even years ago still persist. And particularly the issue was with those mothers who had never had, it was their first pregnancy, that their loss was in their first pregnancy. So there was a lot they didn't know. And, what was interesting, which was not the focus so much of what I was looking at in my research, really we were looking at, asking about their experience about expressing and donating their milk to a milk bank after their loss. And so, but what came up as like a sidebar was those first-time mothers who their experience in one aspect was a little bit different because they had to find their way. And that was the theme. That was how we termed the theme, as finding my way, because they didn't know really what to do. They did not look at that pamphlet. And I know there's also from not only from my practice, but also from my work with some colleagues, that work in the milk bank, that, a lot of times it takes a lot for the mothers to go back and look at the folder that they get. And a lot of times by the time they looked and they found that pamphlet from the milk bank, it was too late, because, making milk is a very time-sensitive process. And so if, they're 2 weeks out, the ability to make milk to any extent is limited. And so, and that was something, that I've heard over and over again from my colleagues that work in the milk bank, that in the milk banks, that typically they don't look at that folder right away. It's not something that they, tend to do. And it can't say across the board, but, it's just something that we see. So, it was trying to find out, what the experience was. And then when I was listening to them, I was hearing these women, say that, people don't talk about it. So even though that wasn't the focus of my research, when they were finding their way, and again, this is mostly those first-time mothers, what I was also hearing them say was people just don't talk about this.
That's why I invited you to do this. When we think about end of life, we forget it's not really just about the death of someone, that there are all these things in place when it comes to the work of care. I think that's, where our work does cross over a little bit, because I did write about my experience of miscarriage through like a graphic novel narrative, which wasn't the first approach. I did the graphic novel narrative 5 years after. So when you speak about not looking at any of the material that was associated with that time, and my pregnancy loss was 19 weeks, so it was really impactful on my body. And the and one of the outcomes of the analytic part of that project, which there was like a whole philosophical and ethical write-up that I did in relation to the narrative, which was that, not only was my body on a script, on a path that was unfolding, but that there was a lack of knowledge and language, that both what was happening to me, only when I opened up about it would I find this gift of people around me who actually had also gone through pregnancy loss. And I called it a privilege that's not a privilege. Like when you know, and it did feel like a solidarity out of battle. That we were in the same battle. And what I also found remarkable that no one had prepared me for, I had at the time that would have been my due date, my body had an autoimmune reaction.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that interesting? And I was like, it was happening, and I had totally disconnected it. And it was really remarkable and notable. My skin had gotten all inflamed and stuff. And my husband said to me, I think it's your due date. And I looked at him and I'm like, I had completely forgotten that was that time, because I was so hard to survive it. My mental state was quite precarious. And but my body was communicating. And I think that's why the research that you started to do and kind of really pushing for how best to have, in some ways, a kind of repair work in the body for women who experience loss like this, or for people who experience loss like this, I think is such a powerful opportunity for knowledge collection. And my argument in my book is that it's solidarity. That one of the things I could find is that no matter whether you have a healthy pregnancy or pregnancy loss, even if you had a procedure that terminated a pregnancy, that the experience itself has such room for solidarity, and yet is so quieted and so suffocating, because it is so individuated. And and when we talk about a theme like care, it's a rich opportunity for us to like re-narrate what we can't recover, especially when you're in it. And and you feel like, I think what you said here was really interesting, that when you're thinking about interventions for people and giving them the opportunity to kind of learn what they had not anticipated, what they did not know, I think is such an important part of our professional practices when you're a caretaker, right? Is that you know exactly what the intervention should be, not the bearer of bad news, but in some ways kind of like, I know you weren't prepared, but I can help you better recover, so that you couldn't have prepared. In some ways, even if you had prepared, there would not have been a lot of room. And I talk about that in the book as my the first time, my first pregnancy was a miscarriage, and I talked about my naivete, my pregnancy naivete, which was, oh, this is wonderful and this is what's happening. It's all exciting, but people had so committed me emotionally and intellectually to the idea that a baby was going to happen. You get pregnant, you have a baby. And I realized what a sabotage that was.
I mean, because that is not the outcome that anybody expects.
Right.
When they get pregnant, whether they planned that pregnancy or not, it is just not the outcome that they, if they go forth with it, it's not the outcome they expect, that the fetus is not going to survive. That is not what they expect. They expect to bring home, a healthy baby, and they have an image in their mind of, and by second trimester, that has already, all of that work, that bonding work has begun. Of course the family hasn't seen, for real. I mean, now we have all these imaging, with the sonogram and all that, but still they still have this image of, what this baby is going to look like. And, when the baby is born, preterm, that's another piece. Even when the baby survives, they have to sort of grieve the loss of the infant they expected, and reconcile themselves with this, 2-pound, scrawny preterm infant that has no body fat and has loose skin and kind of looks like either an old man or an old woman, really. So, having spent, the better part of my almost 47 years, not counting my years even as a nurse's aide, it's more than that. Working with families, I have seen, some of the issues that they have experienced. Having given birth to preterm infants, I've also had some experience with that as well. But, it's interesting what you say, that I think one or two of the mothers that I interviewed said kind of the same thing, was when they did start to talk about it, then they found out, oh, this one had a pregnancy loss, and this one had a pregnancy loss, and this one, and they had no idea,
And there is, I think too, where, there's some mixing of categories that are right important and necessary, from the grassroots position or the most vulnerable stakeholder position, which is that, I ask a question, can there be grief in birth? the whole postpartum phenomenon has some similarities to pregnancy loss in a lot of ways that we don't have language for, because again, medicine has its interventions and its technologies, but a lot of that is designed to preserve the idea of the childbirth, right? And I think the condition of the person giving birth is a bit neglected. And I think when you work, with neonates, you are on the front lines of those mixed categories that neonates die, that not all babies can be saved. Not everything can be that birth story, the romanticized birth story
Right.
a lot of people have, that does sabotage the real care work that goes into, and what I call like a reworlding of myself when I'm experiencing something that's so out of the order of things, right?
Right.
And especially for women who do give birth, that they're supposed to be full of joy and accomplishment. And what you get, especially in a neonate scenario, are people who don't have strategies of care. How do I care for what I've given birth to? And I can't touch anything. I can't, you know what I mean? I don't have the same strategies that I've been right. So I have everything waiting. And so I too have stories of either friends or family members who have gone through that, and knowing that they were robbed of the opportunity of being protected from some of the language that you get when you do end of life care. So they you know what I mean? Some of the grief work, some of the, acceptance, the process of accepting the circumstance rather than keep bringing in the expectation, right? The expectation is the source of a lot of harm, because that's what was supposed to happen. So as soon as you can have people who help you carry out the expectations,
Yeah, well, that
bring
grief work
in
is,
this kind of joyful acceptance, no matter what is the circumstance.
Right,
And joyful
right.
acceptance is a really difficult thing to achieve. And that's if there is a survivorship, right? The acceptance of the fact that I'm alive, and think about how many women don't survive their pregnancies as well.
Mhm.
I'm sure that's part of the catalog of knowledge that you have, is that, focusing on the outcome of a birth. It sometimes is really looking at who gave birth and what happens to them, that part of the care that has to be there, and that those two are not separate care taking activities.
Right. I know that romanticized concept of what, childbirth is all about is, just sometimes as difficult as, the images we see of what the perfect female body should look like, and all of those kinds of things that can really be because it does contribute, again, regardless of outcome, baby survives, baby doesn't survive, the guilt on the part of the mother is tremendous, even for those preterm infants who survive. They reorganize and they move on, but most do, I would say. But the guilt, I mean, I would see it, I would feel it in these mothers when I was, even for babies who, they were born, preterm and small, but they were otherwise doing okay, just finishing their development on the outside. And, because that's by and large, most of those babies do well. When you look at the statistics, particularly, these days, it isn't what it used to be. That's for sure. So, I think that all of that, it does, I think, get in the way to some extent when it comes to end-of-life care. I certainly saw that in the neonatal unit. And so, an end-of-life care is going to look a little different for somebody who has a sudden, unexpected loss, such as a stillborn. And I did have quite a mixture of, because I interviewed 21 women altogether, and there was most, there was preterm infants, and most of them had survived for at least a little while. There were also fetuses with lethal fetal anomalies. There was, I think, a few of them, I don't remember exactly, but there are a few of them also had stillborn infants. One I remember distinctly was stillborn at, was preterm, and another one was stillborn at full term, had gone through labor, and then the baby was born still. So, like problems developed at the very end because she had a relatively uneventful pregnancy. So, there was that mixture, but despite all of that, the themes that came out, again, my focus was the experience of expressing and donating, milk after the perinatal loss. The themes were, the words that they used were almost exactly the same. They used, I remember very distinctly hearing from more than one woman saying that they wanted something positive to come out of the negative, and that I heard that if they didn't use those exact words, that's, really what we were hearing. It was just really a lot of similarities despite the differences. We did also have about half that were, it was their first pregnancy. I think it was 48% were, was first pregnancy, and 52% was they had already had children. So sometimes more than one child already. So, and that was the only thing that we saw different, was the kind of getting started with the milk expression and donation, because the women who had who had children before and had breastfed, they knew exactly what to do. Many of them had been, pumped with their previous pregnancies because they had gone back to work. I remember one mother distinctly saying to me when she had her loss, she said, "Yep, I just dusted off my pump." And, she just, the milk bank was down the block from her. So she just, there was no question in her mind what to do. But those mothers who hadn't, had the experience before of breastfeeding and hadn't, particularly if they were, sort of many of them were, there weren't too many of them that were toward the end that may have been, had availed themselves of classes of some sort. And I did have, women, I would say, I think 18, 19 weeks that were able to bring in their milk and donate. And, it is a possibility, certainly when you have a second trimester loss. So, but that's, so the other part of that is, when I was listening to the, when I was interviewing these women and I was listening to what they were telling me, it was, hard for me, because I'm thinking to myself, where were these healthcare providers when these women were going through this? And of course, the other issue was, so I started interviewing in July of 20. So some of the women that I interviewed, because, the inclusion criteria is, they, of course, they had to have a perinatal loss. They had to donate to a nonprofit milk bank. We excluded anybody who was selling their milk. And they had that experience within the last 2 years. So some of the women, particularly, the women that I did that summer of 20, had their loss before the pandemic. But then some of them, many of them, probably a little bit more than half, probably about 3/4 of them, their loss was during the pandemic. And some of them during the height of the pandemic, when they couldn't even have their partner with them. And so they were just so isolated. And, of course, those who have a, second trimester loss, they deliver and they went home that same day.
I think when you're doing research on anything having to do with systems, historical, intergenerational systems, finding ways to make that past narrative informative and instructive so that you're not falsifying, but you're not fictionalizing, but you're also tapping into what can't be recovered, right? So
Right.
there's aspects of the narrative of what has taken place that really has to be speculative. We have to
Right.
be speculating. And again, the risk is that it's somehow less valid than, the kind of stats I get from like accumulating current research. What else is giving you, what's exciting you? What keeps you going? What do you find as a resource, both for the work, but also for yourself as, just academically, what's happening for you that's giving you life?
Yeah, that's a good question. uh, I think we kind of talked about this in a different situation. I think talking to other people, or people who ask me what I do, and I tell them, I sometimes lie, right? Sometimes I tell them that I study literature, that's it. And then they roll their eyes or whatever, they don't find it interesting, right? But when I'm honest about what I do, then they give me the privilege of listening to their personal experiences with suicide, right? And I know this might come out wrong, right? But what I find empowering is when I get lost in their suffering, when I'm listening to them. And there's something so affirming about the universality, or the seeming universality of suicidality, right? I have yet to meet someone who hasn't thought about suicide themselves, right? I've met a lot of people who have attempted suicide, but the majority of the people that I've talked to, right, have at least thought about it, right? And so they give me that gift, right, of their personal experience with their suffering, right? Suffering, some of them, are actively suicidal, right? But just listening to them, right? And then just they don't see it because they don't study it, right? They don't think about suicide 24/7 like I do, right? I know it sounds very morbid. So that I don't know, I have a bird's eye view of the discourse, right? And so I see how universal the experience is, right? And when I tell them, it's like how universal it is, right? I don't use those exact terms, but I explain to them in response to, or really when I come out from getting lost, right, and their suffering, I respond in ways that affirms their experience. And I do that by saying, like, you're not the only one. There's nothing special about your experience, and that sounds, I'm using those harsh terms now, right? But essentially that's what I'm saying. Like, there's nothing special about that, Unfortunately, that is the human condition in many ways, to think about our own mortality, to think about our own, finitude, And so I know it sounds negative, but there's something very affirming about that, right? The more I hear it, the more affirming it is, precisely because it's so universal, or at least from my perspective, right? Again, I have yet to meet someone who hasn't thought about it, at some point in their lives, right? And that, for me, that's affirming,
I'm so glad you said that, because I think when you think about what you started with you kind of like the onboarding onto this as a kind of what ended up being this kind of vocational research agenda, that there's a kind of depathologizing
exactly
of suffering that you're doing when you are honest about the work you're doing, and a decolonizing effect as well, in being able to like cultivate the listening and the opportunity for people to kind of like tap into a larger perspective, because again, the alienating qualities, the the dehumanizing qualities of being in a position in which that suicidality is manifesting as part of who you are, or part of how you can be in the world, is that part of it is that an option of being not in the world, of wanting to have an exit strategy for the world, that there is this important aspect of comfort in the universality that you're able to kind of offer, in not so much the specialness, but maybe the urgency, that the urgency of feeling like there aren't options, but at least being able to kind of like, and this is something I'm seeing in the work in trauma, is the power of offering re-narrating how that figures into who you are, or how you harness some of the things that have become what is perceived burden. You get to kind of re-carry them. You get to like shift the shoulder, in some ways, not to like invalidate it, but to in some ways allow somebody to like reconfigure it into how they house themselves in relation to that experience. And I think what's also an important part of this, what I think is a nice outcome, is that we have to get away from victim blaming that accidentally folds itself into the questions about suicide. Like you said, it does sound so morbid, and like you can imagine, I'm sure you've had it with just people's reactions. That's why we kind of have to what is that, gauge? We have to gauge our audience for some of this work, because I think that similarly when it came to the miscarriage work, I called it the privilege that's not a privilege, was that once I outed it, women were coming and telling me their stories that they hadn't even told their own children, because suddenly it felt like there was a solidarity that was possible that wasn't possible elsewhere, because you couldn't trust people with that kind of information, because people would get suspicious or start getting really patronizing, and that kind of thing, and weird effects would happen, and that's just too much labor. I don't want to have to explain to everybody like I'm not a victim, or I'm okay now, or don't give me your advice. It's and so I think your work has this power of providing such an alternative, life affirming resource for people who are the most vulnerable by the fact that we haven't done due diligence on this discourse, that we've kind of depended too long on a narrative that fails. And it's dangerous. It's a very dangerous narrative.
I mean, that's not to say that, yes, it is a narrative that fails, but that failure is incredibly productive. And that's the thing, right? It's reproducing power relations, right? That's the thing. It's naturalizing these distinctions. It's naturalizing race and so on, right? I mean, because I hear it often, like Black people don't commit suicide, right? That is a result of that failure that you're talking about, right? So in many ways, in an anti-Black world, it's a necessary failure. And that's exactly what needs to be reckoned with, right? Yeah.
Any last thoughts? Anything else you want to have, maybe that you're thinking about?
I mean, it's
resources, things that you would want people to read, or obviously Toni Morrison.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about Toni Morrison. Gloria Anzaldúa, I actually highly recommend. I'm rereading her now, and her book is really about self-harm in many ways, right? Self-hatred, of course, and so on. But you were talking about, I was thinking of Gloria Anzaldúa, like to use your language, to re-narrativize, right? To reorder, our experiences or suffering. And Gloria Anzaldúa does that, right? And a lot of her metaphors have to do with hurting oneself, right? Not really seeing yourself as a victim or pathologizing yourself, but seeing these wounds, as she suggests, right, as opportunities for developing new knowledge, right? to really try to, in many ways, it's very psychoanalytic, right? It's like, yeah, your symptom has a message, it's saying something, right? Deal with it, right? Grapple with that wound or those symptoms, right? And of course, yeah, there is a telos, right? And gloria and sandulas, and that's decolonization of the flesh, right?
So I started, now I had worked as a nursing student in labor and delivery, and from that experience, I knew that there were perinatal losses. I didn't see it often in the time that I worked as in that area, but I did see it. So that much I have to say. But, then when I graduated and I started working in the neonatal unit, I was less than 6 months working when the first, baby died. The baby that I was caring for died on Christmas Eve. And I felt very ill prepared to help, the family. I just did not feel prepared in any way, shape, or form. And, I always remember all about that experience because it was a traumatic for me. I think it was, disturbing to me on, several levels. But one of the levels being that I just didn't feel that I did right by that family because I just felt it prepared. And so, so that is one of the things that I think, is something that we need to address. When we have people come into, I spent 18 years in staff development, so I have worked with, orienting nurses to pediatrics and neonatal primarily in that time. And I know that, those who have transferred from other units, so from an adult unit or a geriatric unit or an oncology unit, they have in their practice as a nurse have cared for a patient and a family who was at end of life. But, the trend is now, especially the way things are with the nursing shortage, and I have seen this, in my own experience, I've experienced this, I have seen it even after I stopped being an educator and my per diem work, is, having these newly graduated nurses starting in the neonatal unit and just wondering if they're going to be in the same position I am, because are we doing, enough, to prepare, students as new graduates to be able to work with not just the patients, but also the families. I mean, the families are really, really important in this. You have to support them as well. You can't just, and I know in COVID it was really hard because, nobody could visit and whatever, but that's been less of my experience. More of my experience was pre-COVID, fortunately. So I have, you really have to, in order for them to, they have to support each other. I do find that there are, parents, if you have cisgender male, female, just, I guess, because of societal norms, the process, how they deal with the grief can be different. I haven't had as much experience with, same-sex couples, although one of the couples in my study, one of the mothers who I interviewed, had a wife. But, I don't have enough experience to know how that plays out. But just knowing in general, people are different, same gender, different gender, transgender, cisgender. I mean, I think people are different and people deal in different ways. And I think it's important that we have to support the family, because the family is going to support each other when we're no longer in the picture. And, one of the things that, brings this really to my mind is I have for quite a few years participated in the Walk to Remember. I don't know if you've heard of the Walk to Remember. And when, people come, it's not just the mother or the father, it's the grandparents, it's the other children if they've had children after, it's the sisters, it's the aunts, it's it's the cousins. I mean, sometimes it's a smaller group and sometimes it's a tremendous group that comes. And many of them have been, it's been many years since they're lost, but they just want their infant to be remembered. And that's one of the other things that, we heard in the, when analyzing the data, one of the things that we recognize is that legacy, wanting to leave a legacy, and that was really what it was about, is they want, that this fleeting life to, they don't want this fleeting life to be forgotten. It's very different when somebody who's in the 70s and 80s passes away, because they've left a legacy of some sort. People will remember them, not forever. I mean, as you go down generations and generations, but, there's some tangibles, and that's, some of the other issues that we find with these families as well. And that was some of the work that I was doing back in the 80s. I initiated, because that was when this emphasis on recognizing perinatal loss and supporting families. We started to, and the research that was being published at the time, we started perinatal bereavement. I started a perinatal bereavement program in the hospital where I worked. We began taking photographs, offering the families the option to hold the infant after death, providing information about burial, because that was another thing that I found pretty early on was definitely an issue. And that's where I, talk about the ethical aspect. So one of the things that was even more disturbing to me was after, I published, I actually presented this study as a poster at a conference, Association of Women's Health, Obstetrical and Neonatal Nurses Conference, their annual convention it was in June of last year. And while I was standing by my poster, and people would come by and they would look, and I had more than one nurse saying to me, I could never say this to them. That's what they were saying. It's like, they're just going through so much. I would never, then suggest to them that they should, express their milk and donate it to a milk bank. And it's not that you would tell them, but I think in terms of, it can be, or I actually had somebody else said, oh, well, I wouldn't want to, so I wouldn't say that to anybody else. Well, that's not, that's not the correct, that's not appropriate. We have to be providing information, accurate information in a non-directive way. Not that I'm going to, tell them they should or they shouldn't, but, we have to inform, regardless of what we think, we have to inform. And we need to use the evidence. And we need to base our practice on what the evidence is. And, what I heard in that, in those interviews is women saying to me, yeah, I didn't find that pamphlet, or that pamphlet didn't, what did the one mother say? One mother said something like, I went home with a full pregnancy body and I had more questions than that pamphlet would answer. So it's not enough to just think, okay, we've done what we had to do. We put the little, we put some things into that folder and we hand it to them when they go home, but that is not enough. In many cases, it's just not enough.
So I wanted to provoke more of a public discussion. Since then, what has changed? Well, COVID would be a really big thing that's changed. And when COVID started happening, I was very afraid. I was involved with people working in nursing homes in St. Louis, where I live. And, I had the sense you didn't need to be a scholar of this to have the sense that this wasn't going to play out well. But I would also say that there was a strange, maybe even like an unseemly kind of hopefulness on my part that, okay, maybe this is something that will bring this issue to a broader public discussion, and that we could get some momentum. Because to change our long-term care system, which is, I know one of the things you want to talk about is how end of life is a limiting concept in some ways, or at least the way we use it is limiting. You got to talk about long-term care if you're going to talk about end of life care. These are two systems that are essentially on top of one another. Many people who are receiving end of life care do so in long-term care facilities, where the care that they receive is not less essential for dying than the end of life care itself. This is care and what's called activities of daily living. So, very basic, important things, difficult things, especially in this context. And there, our long-term care system and our end-of-life care system are entrenched by enough money, enough time, enough inertia, enough difficult feelings that people don't want to feel, to make it very difficult to generate the political momentum to change them. And so part of me was like, well, maybe this will help. And now, I actually don't know the exact death toll, but I think it was last time I took it was like something like 400,000 or something like that, a very, very high death toll. Later, I don't feel like the changes that I wanted to see happen have happened. I do think that there have been moments of momentum. When President Biden was proposing the Build Back Better Act, there were parts of that bill that would have been more support for caretakers at home, and things that I think could have been very helpful. But I'm working on a committee in St. Louis on nursing homes and COVID. We're going to write a report that I'm very I think it's going to be good. But one thing that I've learned working on the committee that has really sobered me, and I don't really know what it means, is the nursing home population in the city of St. Louis has actually decreased by almost, I think, 10 years of age in the past 10 years. So meaning that, I forget exactly what it was, but it was like 75 to 68, like the median age before was 75, now it's 68. So people are getting into nursing homes younger. They're getting in with more severe mental illnesses as well. So that's a piece of this as well. And they're in there with everybody else, and everybody else is in there with them. And, it's not a highly differentiated environment once you get in there. It's sort of like the institutions of old, right? Where it's just like, well, people who don't fit in kind of fall into this vehicle, and that's not really good for anybody who's in there. But that's kind of what's happening. And it makes me really concerned. So I would say that and one more thing, and then I'll stop. The other thing that's happened since then is Canada, our neighbors to the north, you're closer to them than I am, in New York, has gone on to pass, what I think Trudeau Lemons, who's a scholar I respect a lot, has called the most radical euthanasia bill in the world. So something that, they're working out the process, but that's going to make euthanasia, so not aid in dying, not assisted suicide. So this is where doctors are killing, or at least ending, the life of patients with long-term disabilities. That's already done. That was Bill C7, and now they're going to extend it to people who are mentally ill. And I think that has given me a lot to chew on in terms of, I haven't changed my perspective on the aid in dying debate in America, but it has definitely made me very afraid and moved me closer to saying, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a harder thing to stay neutral from a disability rights perspective than I had previously thought.
The poverty of the discourse between what disability studies and critical disability studies does and offers, and what trauma response professionals and people trained in trauma and even academic work in trauma are doing. And there's huge gaps between the two discourses, ironically. But yet, whenever we do any of this kind of work, we're tripping on all these kinds of aspects of trauma or aspects of disability
Right.
that have very rich, kind of investigations attached to them to really like explore what this means or how this is operative. And again, I think that's why your work is so helpful to me, is you really attending to those affective demands that occur and not proselytizing in any way.
Well, I appreciate, and let me just say, huge, this weird confluence of huge gaps and huge overlaps, and it's the exact same area. So like the exact same thing where you're like, trauma is disability. Like, it's like literally the same thing. Like, we're talking about the exact same thing, yet there's no conceptual space. We don't occupy the same conceptual space. And, I mean, this is why I really appreciate you framing the psychotherapy thing as kind of coming out of my scholarship, because I haven't, over the past year I've been doing this, I haven't always thought of it that way. Like, sometimes I've been like, but as scholars, to be pejorative, like we work in the concept factory. What we try to do is we try to create concepts that capture more of experience. I know that's not all we do, and it's like sort of limiting, but that's a big part. So how can we create a concept that can, sort of, I don't know, fill in the gap or do something, like basically, so make it so that this overlap can manifest as something other than a complete absence of contact. And to do that, we need words. And, you need to spend time alone thinking about that, actually, and bringing these things together. And so I am, as much as I've enjoyed and grown from being with other people and doing this sort of thing, it is really important that there are people, scholars, to sit about and try to create concepts that can allow us to come together in ways that there's so much potential for, but which we've been unable to do.
Yeah, and I think, the approach that you take, the method that you take, what you are able to do, and have done, I think, with great facility, is hold on to what is in the realm of often experience and bring it into a framework that it is validating, which is hard to do, because I think sometimes there is that problem of the academic capture, this armchair thinker. And so in philosophy, I think for me it's that that which is not spoken for, giving place to it, finding something that could be a new tool or a new toolkit, new framework to borrow from. If not, it's disposable, right? So the idea is that, I would say after the ableism book, I was like, this is a book that should get extinguished in its use because it worked. Because once you are able, like a book on sexism from the 60s, hopefully it transitions into something not like this, so that no one would need to go back and keep drawing from the book in some, way. And so I appreciate that aspect of your work too, that is the field work component. That's this nice aspect of that. So the housing stuff, I really, as you move on to it, I'm going to probably draw from again and want to hear more about.
Well, actually, okay, so in the last, I don't want to call an end to it, but just say in the last 5 minutes, I don't think this is the worst note we could sort of end on, which is, I think maybe, since we both are disability studies scholars, I don't know if that's why you got into this, but I know that's a big part of what you've been doing. I think it is why I got into this. We could maybe talk a little bit about the specificity of disability studies, which we haven't maybe emphasized in this conversation. And I think it's worth emphasizing because, Jen, unfortunately, I think your book is going to be current for a while. And I say that, having read No Pity by Joseph Shapiro, which to my mind is still a freaking incredible book that I teach to undergraduates. And unfortunately, it's very current. It's aged far too well. You read the first chapter with, a bunch of 18 years or 19-year-olds. You ask them about the Capitol Crawl. Have you guys ever heard of the Capitol Crawl? Have you ever seen a video of it? They have zero idea of what you're talking about. And the shocking thing is, once they learn, they think it's pretty cool, actually. it's not like this is an idea that's so unpalatable to people intrinsically, but we've made a lot of progress in America, and I think it's important to take that in and sort of be like, yes, there are things about disability rights in America that are incredible, like just it's an incredible story in some ways, and yet somehow that hasn't really changed. Like I said, the nursing home population is dropping in age. That's like the nightmare of people in the 70s in the disability rights movement. If you would tell them at the end of 40 years plus of doing this, busting your ass, putting your body on the line to make things better, people are going to be getting into nursing homes younger, they would be like, what are you talking about? Like, that was like, I think that there are lots of disagreements in disability rights, but like unnecessary institutionalization of people who could be living freely in society would be the one thing that I think everyone, the most Republican disability rights advocate, the most, left-wing Marxist would be like, no, that's really bad, actually. And yet here we are. So, I'm not sure exactly what the specificity of disability is, but, I do think that, even as you were talking about the kind of suicide thing and the race and suicide, and about how suicide of African Americans often not labeled like as such in coroner reports, that's a thing that's that does raise this issue of the right to die again, and sort of questions about ableism, and things like how do we report the deaths of disabled people, and do we sometimes write out the violence that causes their deaths? And we do this with lots of other groups as well, by the way. So it's not just disability, but I think like any category, like dying, like race, there are things that link it to other categories and are maybe analogous, and there's also stuff that's very specific to it. And I'm not entirely sure what that is, but it seems like to hope that people continue to think about it, because unfortunately it's still relevant that we need to be thinking about disability as we're thinking about all this other stuff too.
Many women have reported that the process of expressing and donating their milk has, helped them through the grief process. Most of the women that, that were in my study, I would say, and from what I know from my colleague who works at the New York Milk Bank, as a matter of fact, they don't keep up forever. I mean, they do it for a month, 6 weeks. It does enable them to, so what they do is, as they start to, feel that they want to kind of move on, they, do what mothers who are breastfeeding would do when they want to wean. They start, spacing out the expressing the milk. And then by doing that, they make less and less. And they get to the point where, the pumping, it doesn't yield much. So they make the decision to stop. And that was also another theme, is that, the decision to stop expressing it, was, for most of the, in fact, all the women, spoke to that as being something that was bittersweet, I guess was one of the ways it was described. And, interesting, I worked with a team on this, and interestingly, we kind of thought that maybe they stopped because of the reasons why other breastfeeding mothers stop, because they go back to work and all that, all of the stress of working and all that. That never came up. That never came up. Not one of these women said specifically that they stopped because they had to return to work. Not one of them. But what they all said in one way or another was they recognized that it was time to move on.
That is so helpful. I think of there's so little opportunity for empowerment when you've been put in that kind of position, right? Because in some cases, you're sent home same day. It's almost like as if you had gone through an outpatient procedure. And what's so interesting about what you're arguing, and I think the claim is really valid, is that, there's so little room for anything to be consensual at that point, that giving them that little bit of option, that little bit of information, just really neutrally even, can give them an opportunity to feel like there's some consent involved in what happened. And at the same time too, I hear that in the fact that there is this like moment of empowerment about wanting to stop too.
Right.
I think after my loss, what my problem was is I couldn't go back to work just because I looked pregnant and I didn't want anybody to ask me how the baby was, because I still had such a pregnant looking body.
Mhm.
Was terrifying to me. And I could imagine that opportunity to kind of like let my body process. It is such an important step because it's not like a loss of a loved one. It is your body has to, like, there's such a physicality to the mourning and the grief process, and there's no ritual. There's no social cultural rituals short of ones that might
Rituals.
be
Right.
heavily religious. And at the same time, those religious rituals may be also a little damaging, also a little limiting, and there is no room for this sense of what a important observation that is, to see that over and over again. When they stop not for the external constraints, but because it gives them an internal, there's a bittersweetness of saying that I'm making this step, and this step is like there's a reclaim in it.
Right. That here's my control. This is what I can control, and this is what I'm going to control. I think altogether the women that I interviewed were from 11 different states and 7 different milk banks. There's 34 milk, Human Milk Banking Association of North America has 34 milk banks. So only having 7 of them was just a small number. But the women that I interviewed, spoke very highly about the milk banks and the support they provided, the recognition they provided. It was something that was important. But on the delivery side, where the loss happens in the neonatal unit, in the labor and delivery unit, in the hospital, for those who have a second trimester loss, these I think we can do better. I'm sure there are some places that have really fine-tuned this, and but other places clearly, so I've been in practice long enough to have seen a lot. So I have seen the evolution of organ donation, and I liken this to organ donation. And now the way organ donation is so organized. There is a set process, and it's not like it's, there is a who's eligible, what we have to do, if it's somebody we think that's eligible, who meets the criteria, because there is criteria. So, there is a process that we have to follow. And I would like to see, and it's not likely to happen in my lifetime, but I'd like to see something similar with milk donation. Yes, I've worked in the neonatal unit for a long time, and yes, we use donor milk in the neonatal unit, and yes, I have definitely seen it to be a benefit to preterm infants. But I would much prefer those preterm infants get mother's own, as a first choice. But sometimes it's not possible either, because some issue the mother has, some health issue, or she has twins or triplets, and in those early days it's just not easy to make enough for 3 or 2. So we use donor milk, but I'm not as interested in how much milk, or I'm more interested, because I truly believe that for a substantial number of women, this would really help them. And I think we have to take the bias out of it. The bias is, oh, I would never want to do that. Or the bias is, oh, African American women, they don't breastfeed. So I'm not going to offer that to that woman, because she probably wouldn't breastfeed anyway. We have to take the biases out of it. We have to have a very sensitive, certainly sensitive, like organ donation. I mean, it's a sensitive topic. And I've been on that side of it because I have in my career worked in the PICU. So I have, firsthand experience with, because a lot of the kids that wind up in our PICU wind up being organ donors because they're otherwise healthy and then they get hit by a car. So, I think we could use that as a model. And, again, inform, non-directive. Share the evidence. Some women find that it helps them get through the grief process. And, be honest that you can start and if you feel that you can't continue or you want to stop, you can stop whenever. Most of the milk banks do have in order for them to take your milk, they want to have a guarantee of a certain amount of milk, but they usually waive that requirement for bereaved mothers. At least the ones that, that I know of, they waive that requirement. So they don't have any kind of minimum amount. They'll take any amount. In order for it to go to a preterm infant, the mother has to agree to testing. If she doesn't agree to testing, and that wasn't the case in, the women, of course, that I spoke to, they had all, donated. But one woman, because of the medication she was on initially, knew that at least the milk she donated initially would only be used for research.
I mean, I think this is an exceptionally good analogy. And I think also a really good example of what solidarity looks like when it is driven by the people who are most affected or who are on the front lines of the caretaking, who have to live with these things and who should be the first position of consent, right? The ones who should be the ones we are caring for. I so appreciate this. We're almost out of time. Do you want to talk about what you're working on now? Anything that's exciting you? Anything out there that you just want to do a shout out?
Well, I think the thing that inspires me is, the women that I have, the families that I have worked with and been with that have had this experience. When I was working as a staff nurse in the neonatal unit, when I volunteer for the walk, the Walk for Life, all of the families that, they've touched me and have given me, the incentive to try to make this better. Also, talking and working with like-minded colleagues. I do have several colleagues that feel as passionately about this as I do. And, it's important. It's, I think it can happen because I saw it happen with organ donation. Of course, it happened over, but it was actually not so many years. But I think it is something that, can happen. Just people have to kind of move past some of the biases they have. I mean, I think also, just in terms of the disparities, because actually one of the women that I interviewed was African American, and she challenged me because she said that to me that do you know that this disparity in the African American women do not breastfeed, they have lower breastfeeding rates. And I said, yes, I'm aware, and it wasn't surprising to me that less African American women are donating. But again, how much is that is because of bias. And, so I think there's a lot of work that can be done. What I haven't actually started a project yet, but it's kind of in here. And what I'm looking to do is to try to, either do focus groups or interviews or survey. I haven't decided which, but getting the nurses' perspective on this. What inhibits them? Or what is their experience? If I do it as a qualitative study, what is their experience with working with women who have families have a perinatal loss, with the question about talking to them about milk expression and donation. So that's really kind of, because I think to address anything, I'm going to have to, it's going to, if you wanted to, you got to start somewhere. I think we have to really work in with the healthcare providers. I think one of the other things that I think can complicate things sometimes is the fear of litigation. And that's why, like, nobody wants to, in certain circumstances, if it's, 19 weeks and the baby had a deformity, or, but if it's, a term baby who's runs into a problem in delivery, and then baby is stillborn, there's all this fear of litigation. And so, anxiety in the healthcare institution amongst the healthcare providers is high. And then is that you feel constrained to say anything because you're afraid you're going to say the wrong thing. And, I actually, and I remember, this is going back a long way, but I remember when I was reaching out to others to say, like, well, what happens when a baby dies? What do you say? And I was told never to say, I'm sorry, because that denotes that I was at fault. And I was like, really? Like, when I go to a wake and, for somebody's father, I say, I'm sorry your father died, and in this case would be, I'm really sorry your baby died. And I didn't see what was wrong with saying I'm sorry, but I was cautioned not to say that.
The compliance culture, it's something I see when we work with future teachers and education. There are all these ways in which a lot of our professional practices are shaped by compliance. And there are some things that are really important, obviously, about compliance, but this idea of care then should not be a site of friction. In other words, how do you care? How do you share or alleviate the position of grief in a way that's humanizing and humane and kind and tender, in settings where, in the background, there's always that question of, you don't want to get sued. I think it really becomes really, it can create a real, the patient experience then becomes secondary to the, persistence on certain practices. And again, where would be the moral imagination? What I like what you said about when you're thinking about something that gives you inspiration moving forward is the collegiality amongst your colleagues who are working on this and working with you, working on, on some aspect of it, or just see what you're doing and can confirm, and you can strengthen where you are, is that the collegiality becomes really so I'm not surprised that the next step would be talking to nurses who have that dilemma. The concept in ethics about moral injury becomes really important. What happens when you're in a position of professional service and you have to make decisions that go against your conscience, right? That make you feel like, right. And I think that's also where these kinds of dialogues are really helpful, because you can't do it in the practice, but as a meta opportunity to really give this question some legs, so that communities that are working on these issues or working in the field and dealing with these issues could really have an honest conversation amongst themselves about how much they might be prioritizing compliance over care, with best intentions. Like, no matter what the intentions of all the stakeholders involved, I think that's why there'll be another episode just on trauma that we're doing. And I think when you create environments that are trauma inducing or trauma amplifying, the obligation of everybody to reconfigure the environment becomes a social and political one. Like, we have to then rethink the room. We have to rethink the space. We have to rethink how we frame that space, because those people who are already very vulnerable to trauma, you don't want to exacerbate those conditions. And as some of my work is also like on birth trauma narratives, people who have experienced really, really almost unsurvivable conditions. even if they've had a child, even with the birth.
Right.
So there's some nice overlap here too with some of the
Yes, because there are
other
some who have had loss who have also had that traumatic experience as well.
Yeah. So the overall hope for the episode 2 is this move of what care means and moving toward these ideas of communal care and community care and reframing the work of care. I'm thinking of Leah Lakshmi Pepsina Samarasina's work on care work, dreaming disability justice, that the overall hope is that with this particular episode, this idea that what care means will have to also follow suit in what the research is doing, which is saying, for these systemic failures, for these category failures, for these theoretical reframings, but we also have to be thinking about like interventions that are much more radical in their origin and how we fund them and feed them and resource them, how we cultivate them and grow them. And I think many people who are the most vulnerable in our society create care networks that aren't at all recognized in the ways that they should be for all the real work of survivorship, of creating survivors who have knowledges that need to be archived, the new archive of, care communities, something that doesn't fit in the capitalist system at all. But that's what my large hope is as an ethicist, is that we are thinking about like, what would it mean to create new models of interventions that are democratic and organic and belong to people. In my book on addressing ableism, at the very end, I say, ableism is a dismembering phenomenon.
Yeah.
And whatever it is to be anti-ableist would have to be a kind of end-membering, where one finds ways in which one can build whatever membership would be, again, even in the sense of our, bodily membership. But that for me was like it's an operative term that I'm using when I think about this. But I think that's part of why I like where we've gone with this, because it's so connected for me in a way that I imagine people from outside might think it's very disconnected. But for me, these are like forms of dismembering that we see in all, these pockets of our society, where only when we're digging in the trenches of it, and again, your labor is so valuable and your work is so powerful, because I think it feels like a third rail problem, but I think once you start learning the right tools, you become the person who goes into the fire. In the rescue sense of the word, is I think we really need to not see it for the fire. We need to see it as a project of salvage. We need to be salvaging. We need to be figuring out what it is to reframe this so that we can imagine this as a real humanitarian project.
Right. Or maybe not salvage, but destroying. That's another way of approaching it, right? And build solidarity and practices of care around desire to destroy certain systems. Right?
And I think if we think about how much this work is related to the frameworks of captivity, again, all the more reason. I love that you connected, this idea of the lynching question, because I think people think that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And it doesn't, again, the connection is going to be so potent because I think the responsibility has yet to be grappled with properly.
Yeah, right.
Right. So housing instability is directly related to the problem of institutionalization, that we can go all the way back through the history of who gets institutionalized, and what conditions and what resources we provide institutionalization, and how much we don't consider it an asset in our culture to think about our care infrastructures and invest in our care infrastructures as places of life, places of still living, right? So that it is kind of like a throwaway or it's an aspect of throwaway that is very, once you do the investigation, it feels like an emergency. It feels like a lot of, and so that's the other part of it too, that I think where our work is very kindred, is always trying to find where the labor is. Where is the labor being done that's unwaged, unrecognized, the most life destroying rather than life affirming labors, especially when it comes to caretaking at the end of life, where those should be the life affirming labors. Though that should never be the place in which dying becomes the place in which things are destroyed. I think that's one of the things you mentioned in the book too, about that, all the discourse about dignity in death. Well, what are we doing? What conversation are we having if we're leaving it to these institutional resources?
Yeah, I just want to end by emphasizing that really provoking sentence, you just uttered, which, dying should never be the place where things are destroyed. I just want to leave it at that. I'm not entirely sure what it means, and I mean that in the best way, because I think that a lot is in that, but it really does hit for me. I think that is a wonderful thing to keep thinking about. So thanks.
I hope you found our conversation enriching. I want to pause to acknowledge that Molloy University is located on the lands once home to Indigenous peoples, including the Lenape, the Montaukett Indian Nation, and Indigenous peoples who resided in the Massapequa, Merrick, and Rockaway territories. We recognize the long and complex history that has brought us to these lands, and we seek to understand the ongoing impact of settler colonialism and its influence on the cultures and heritages of Indigenous peoples. We remember and acknowledge our connections to Indigenous peoples and appreciate the opportunity to live and learn on this land. We honor the Indigenous peoples of the past, today, and in generations to come. I would also like to thank my guests today. Much thanks goes to Kim Geary and Liz Mandracchia for their administrative and promotional support of the podcast, and the Office of the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences and the faculty of the Philosophy Department at Molloy. I appreciate all of the help and assistance. For any questions or concerns or comments or ideas for future podcasts, please email us at csec@molloy.edu. Thanks again for joining us.